Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. We made it. We did it. It's 2021. Um, I'm not going to make any predictions or any sort of optimism about 2021. There's no guarantee that it's going to be better than 2020, but 2020 was, especially for those of us who live in the great United States of America, a pretty rough year. Which is why I'm lazy, but I wanted to do something a little different to ring in the new year. I'm gonna talk about some other bad years, some bad years throughout history. I think this should be fun. I forgot about this mostly because it's the same day as New Year's, but it is the 217th anniversary of the Haitian Revolution. Um, and that's really cool. And I've spoken a couple of different times about the Haitian Revolution. If you are one of the people who's been to my in-person talks, and I would like to again, and I could probably extemporaneously forever. I love talking about the Haitian Revolution, but the next time I do something on it will probably be some sort of video essay because there's just so much to talk about, and I want to do it justice, and it'll give me an excuse to reread or read some of the things that I'm enthusiastic about. So um, stay tuned for that. But today, I'm going to talk about some bad years. And my criteria for this, I'm thinking about it, right? This is 2020. It's been kind of a rough year, pandemic, lots of bad things happening. But I wanted to sort of draw a comparison, right? So, history, I want to emphasize, and I hope that I'm emphasizing this by everything that I do here. It's worth learning about history, even if it doesn't have like a valuable like application, right? You shouldn't learn about history because it can necessarily like teach you something that you can apply. It's just worth knowing about, period. But there is one of the things that I think is very valuable about it is context. I think that having historical context, putting your position in time in a framework of all other histories is useful. And so I was thinking about 2020, right? So it's a global pandemic, right? It affects us all. It's unique, right? Because it's global. We've had global pandemics before, but they're rare. And this is the information age. This is our first pandemic in 100 years, or pandemic in 100 years. And a lot of us have lived in a pretty like stable existence. This is one of the biggest problems I think facing the United States, especially, is that we have not had to deal with any major disruptions to our lives in half a century or more. So I was thinking about what does a bad year look like, right? Contextually. So I tried to pick some years, did some research, read what other historians thought that were global or had global implications and were as bad as this one. And it turns out there's a lot of bad years out there, worse than this one, way worse. So I hope that you'll enjoy this trip down history lane while we talk about all the horrible things that have happened to human beings in just one year throughout time. So there's no order to this. I'm going chronologically. I have not rated these best to worst years. I'll try to stop and tell you which ones I think are the worst. But we're just going to start at the beginning of sort of human history and then work our way up. I was forced to stop well before the modern day, though there are some other years that I think are worth including, just because I ran out of time. So maybe I'll do a part two at some point, but there's a lot of bad years. So here we go. All right, so our first bad year is, and I'm cheating a bit here, sometime around 7,000 or 7,500 BCE. Now, this year, we don't know exactly, obviously, because this is before written history, but there's genetic evidence that human population was reduced to between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding pairs, that there were almost no human beings left on the planet. And there's evidence that this may have occurred because of an eruption in Lake Toba, which caused a sort of volcanic winter and a drop in temperatures between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius. Now, I should emphasize that all of this is extremely controversial and contested. The genetic pairs thing appears to be a little bit more justified. The whole Lake Toba connection is a little bit fuzzy. It does seem like, based on geological evidence, that it was especially cold and especially inhospitable around this time. And this happens a couple of times throughout prehistory when humanity comes within Lake Toba. Sorry, I didn't write this down. I think it's in Indonesia. Lake Toba is in Indonesia, in northern Sumatra. Sorry, I apologize. I think I have the locations of all the other things that are going to happen. But this erupted, one of the largest eruptions in human history, causing a volcanic winter, spewing ash into the sky, reducing temperatures by several degrees centigrade. And according to the theory, and this is a theory, causing human population to diminish to basically non-existence, and that all human beings are descended from sort of these 1,000 to 10,000 breeding pairs. So, if this is true, this was a pretty rough year to be alive. Bad time to be a human being. The next sort of worst year is, again, this is fuzzy. Sorry, I'm cheating. Sometime around 12,000 BCE. Sorry, I said 75,000 BCE. I think I said 7,500. I meant 75,000 BCE was the first one. This is 12,000 BCE. So around this time, and this is more general, but around this time in the 1,000 years between 12,000 and 10,000, about 34% of all medium to large mammals and 70 to 80% of all very large or giant mammals, like the woolly mammoth, giant sloths and things, go extinct. And it's clear from the evidence that climate is changing. There is a hypothesis, though, that there was a date, again, around 12,000 BCE, where a comet or fragments of a comet, some of them larger than 4 kilometers in diameter, struck or disintegrated above North America, South America, Europe, and Western Asia, and resulted in the extinction of a lot of Pleistocene megafauna, and caused the end of the Clovis culture, which is a prehistoric pottery and tool culture. This hypothesis suggests that this event brought about the extinction of many species in North America, specifically like the megafauna, camels, mammoths, the giant bears, other species like that. It was also supposed to have caused extensive burning of biomass, a brief winter, and abrupt climate change. This is also highly controversial and highly contested, though it is clear that around this time there is a major extinction event happening of large land mammals. The other possible reason for this is that humans overhunted them. So I'm counting this as a bad year for humans, though really it's our own fault, potentially. We're going to get a little bit more specific now, though, because our next bad year is, and this is not quite precise, it's sort of a 5-year range, but 1642 before the Common Era. And this is when the volcano at Thera, which is now the island of Santorini, erupts. And Thera at the time was part of the Minoan kingdom, Minoan Empire. And this eruption was a major catastrophic volcanic event. It destroyed the island of Thera, essentially obliterated the settlement at Akrotiri, as well as the communities and agricultural areas of Crete nearby. It also caused earthquakes and tsunamis. It seems like the people at Akrotiri had a chance to evacuate. No bodies were found. It doesn't seem like it was Pompeii, but it was pretty bad. Lava and then full-on explosion. In addition to what this caused in just sort of the immediate Mediterranean, there is evidence that this caused a volcanic winter as far away as China. There are records in the Bamboo Annals around the time of the collapse of the semi-legendary Xia dynasty and the rise of the Shang dynasty around 1618, 1640, which records a yellow fog, dim sun, a yellow fog, dim sun, and then 3 suns, frost in July, famine, and the withering of all 5 cereals, the grain crops. There were apocalyptic rainstorms, which devastated Egypt and are inscribed on the Tempest Stele of Ahmose I, which have been attributed to short-term climatic changes caused by the Theron eruption. The eruption may have also inspired the myths of the Hesiod's Theogony, and the Titans and all their stories about that. Some of this is fuzzy. The records are kind of unclear. But there seems to be evidence that this year was a pretty bad one and that this eruption spewed ash into the atmosphere and caused potentially cooling all around the globe. The next particularly bad year is 184 CE, and this is the start of the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And this happens in the 3rd month of 184. Zheng Jiao, who is the leader of the Way of Supreme Peace, a Taoist movement, with his brothers Zhang Liang and Zhang Bao, led this movement in a rebellion against the government, which is now called the Yellow Turban Rebellion. This movement grew to number in the hundreds of thousands, receiving support from all over China. Their motto was, "The firmament has perished. The yellow sky will soon rise. In this year of Jiazi, let there be prosperity in the world." I'm cheating a bit here because this year itself wasn't particularly bad, but the fallout from the Yellow Turban Rebellion began what is now known as the Three Kingdoms period, which you may be familiar with, which resulted in the death or displacement of somewhere in the vicinity of 36 million Chinese, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the global population. It's a little hard to determine the global consequences of this event, but in terms of just how it impacted the world, overall human suffering, the consequences of the Yellow Turban Rebellion and the Three Kingdoms period is hard to understate. So I'm throwing this in here. This next one is a fun one, and I was doing research. I found that several historians and historian-adjacent people counted the year 536 CE as the worst year ever to be alive. And the reason for this is that there was a cataclysmic volcanic eruption in Iceland, which spewed ash across most of the northern hemisphere in early 536. And then there were 2 subsequent eruptions in 540 and 547. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year. Temperatures all around the world in the summer of 536 fell 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, the coldest decade in the past 2,300 years. Snow fell in the summer in China. Crops failed. People starved. The Irish Chronicles list a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Just 5 years later, the plague of Justinian begins, which which was the first serious instance of the Black Plague from later. And don't worry, they'll be making a return appearance, which killed 30 to 50 million people in Europe and Western Asia. 10 years before this, in 526, there was an earthquake in Antioch, also in the Byzantine Empire, which had killed as many as 300,000 people. Now, this was obviously worse if you lived in Europe, but if you lived anywhere in the world, this was a pretty bad year. Really bad. Sun, like, blotted out of the sky, starvation, snow in the summer. Pretty fucking bad. Bad year. So 536, probably close to one of the worst years ever. The next bad one is 1258 CE, the year of the sack of Baghdad by Hulagu Khan. So I have talked about the Mongols before, and I can't get into too much detail because I go on forever, but the forces of the Ilkhanate under the orders of Ogadai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, I believe. Sorry, I haven't done any research or updated myself. But anyway, Ogadai, the Khan, after Genghis Khan, ordered the invasion of the Abbasid Caliphate. He may have been his son. Nephew? I don't remember. The Abbasid Caliphate, a great Muslim polity that stretched, across a great part of the Middle East. Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate with 1 million citizens, and it was a center of trade, learning, and innovation. So contemporary accounts from this sack in 1258 state that Mongol soldiers looted and then destroyed mosques, palaces, libraries, and hospitals. Priceless books from Baghdad's 36 public libraries were torn apart. There are reports that the Mongols used their leather covers as sandals. The House of Wisdom, the Grand Library of Baghdad, was burned as well, containing countless precious historical documents and books on subjects from everything from medicine to astronomy. There are stories that the Tigris turned black from the ink of books that were thrown into it. The Sultan was wrapped in a rug and trampled to death by horses because, trampled to death by horses because it was believed that spilling the blood was a sin against God, spilling his blood. This is considered the end of the golden age of Islam. And some of this is probably exaggerated by later Islamic scholars, but it's interesting. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is an event that actually probably didn't happen the way that it's perceived. There was a fire nearby, but it wasn't destroyed. It just sort of faded. This is, in terms of knowledge lost, in terms of halting human progress, an event that should be counted among, as great as the burning of the Library of Alexandria. I am, and have been throughout my life, a Mongol apologist for no good reason aside from I think they get a bad rap. But this is a bad thing, and caused great devastation, and I think in a lot of ways shifted the course of human history in a way that is not good. And a couple of these bad years are going to be more about that than about absolute deaths. And 1258 CE counts among one of those years that sort of diverted history in a way that turned out to be not so good. This was a very tragic outcome for a city that had once been great, and for people that valued knowledge and learning, trade, and innovation, and had been prosperous until Hulagu Khan and his Mongol looters tore the city to shreds. Our next bad year is 1347, and this could be 1348 or 1349, but this is 1347 seems like the best one. This is the worst year of the Black Death, the plague, again first seen in Justinian's time, spread by fleas that lived on rats. I am not going to go into too much detail about this. I think I probably should do a talk about the Black Death at some point, just because I can. But I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because you know a lot about it, and if you don't, I'll talk about it more later. But This is estimated to have killed anywhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population alone. In total, the plague may have reduced the world population from around 500 million to 350 million in the 14th century. Petrarch wrote that our hopes for the future have been buried alongside our friends. A writer in Damascus recorded that the plague sat like a king on a throne and swayed with power, killing thousands every day. Dogs tore at the bodies that lay unburied in the streets. Whole families were killed. It drove people absolutely nuts in Europe. There's a lot of talk about how this indirectly, by depopulating somehow led to the rise of living standards and capitalism and blah, 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 innovation. I have a lot of questions about that. I'm going to put a pin in it for a future talk, but ultimately I think that anything that kills millions of people is bad, even if we bounce back better. 1347, real bad year to be alive, no matter where you are in the world. All right, this next one is more locally central or focused, but still a pretty bad year. 1520, and this is the year that smallpox arrives in force in South and Central America, and as a consequence, basically, all existing civilizations in South America are devastated, crushed. If you were around for my talk on guns, germs, and steel, I think that there's some disagreement about how quickly and how directly this devastated the indigenous population. But ultimately, millions died, 60 to 90% of the population. The Spanish monk Motolina wrote of this, as the Indians did not know the remedy of the disease, they died in heaps. In many places, it happened that everyone in a house died, and it was impossible to bury the great number of the dead. The consequences of this are wide-reaching. Colonialism, imperialism, also just straight-up deaths of millions of people. If somehow smallpox had not arrived on the shores, if somehow indigenous populations had not been so vulnerable to it, I think we would be facing a very different and possibly less awful history. So in terms of overall human suffering, 1520, pretty bad year. All right, our next very bad year is 1783. So in 1783, the Loki Fissure in Iceland erupted in what is known as, and I'm going to fuck all these words up, Skaftarildar, or the Skafta Fires. 14 cubic kilometers of lava were spewed from this eruption. There were lava fountains that were estimated to have reached heights of 800 to 1,400 meters. The gases carried by this eruption column reached 15 kilometers high. There were 8 million tons of hydrogen fluoride and 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide spewed into the atmosphere. For Iceland, this was known as, I'm not even going to say that, sorry. It translates as mist hardships. And an estimated 25% of the population died, either from famine or fluoride poisoning. 80% of sheep, 50% of cattle, 50% of horses died. They developed these growths from the fluoride, dental fluorosis and skeletal fluorosis. This had effects of weakening the African and Indian monsoons. So there were about a tenth of an inch less daily precipitation than normal over the Sahel, which had a lot of effects, including low flow in the River Nile. The famine in 1784 killed about a sixth of the population of Egypt. It also affected the southern Arabian Peninsula and India. In Japan, the Great Tenmai famine was already underway and was worsened and prolonged. The sulfur dioxide from this eruption caused a thick haze to spread across Western Europe, killing many thousands over 1783 and 1784. A fog covered the sun for weeks. There were thunderstorms that produced hailstones that were big enough to kill cattle in northern Europe and Britain. The summer of 1783 was the hottest on record, and the winter was exceptionally severe. In the one of the consequences of this was that the agricultural malaise in France and the food problems of food production got even worse, and this was probably directly responsible for driving people into poverty, bread riots, and ultimately the French Revolution. So not all bad, but pretty bad. Really bad year. Everyone say hello to Wellington. Wellington. Next bad year is 1816. In 1815, Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in present-day Indonesia erupted. This was, at that point, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The ash and dust spewed into the atmosphere caused floods and famines in China, India, and Central Asia, crop failures in Europe, and a persistent dry fog that covered much of the eastern U.S. There was blue and yellow snowfall, cold summers, a change in the color of the sky. There were a lot of paintings from this time period that recorded a really reddish yellow, a beautiful sky, but it was clearly something was going on in the atmosphere. Newspapers in the eastern U.S. wrote that the summer basically never came, and people were lighting fires in June and July. It was a pretty bad year, all things considered. I mean, I don't know like what people thought. In a lot of these cases, it's interesting that it took later historians and geologists examining the geological record or other things to sort of like put together. There wasn't like a great deal of, there wasn't a good way to connect what happened in, Sumatra or Sumbawa to what was happening elsewhere in the world. It just seemed like a bad year to a lot of people. And a lot of people did blame it on, God's punishment or whatever, but no more than the thing is like everything was God's punishment, right? So like, if your kid died, that was God's punishment. If the sky turned yellow, that was God's punishment. So it wasn't any different than any other year, except that it was substantially worse. Our next bad year, and this, for me, this is, in my opinion, number one on worst years in history. 1848. I think, yeah. So this is, if you were here, I gave a talk on this not too long ago. Hello, terrorist gaming. Do not terrorize me. This is known as the Springtime of the Peoples. So in 1848, a wave of revolutions spread across Europe. Germany, France, Hungary, Poland, Austria, Italy, Greece, everywhere. People rose up in a great, sort of outcry for justice, for liberty, for freedom, and we're fucking crushed. We're just absolutely walloped by the forces of reaction. We're betrayed by liberals. Almost all of these revolutions, though they may have achieved some minor successes, were defeated without achieving any of their goals. And what's so heartbreaking about this for me is that, in a world where it's pretty easy to find problematic elements of otherwise good revolutions, these were, in a lot of cases, aside from being a little bit too nationalist, people asking for very basic things that we now take for granted. Free press, free association, voting rights, representation in government. And in every case, the royalty, the aristocracy, the forces of reaction just fucking stomped on them. And they failed to come together. They failed to organize. They came so close. I feel like I'll talk about this again sometime, but to me, if I were writing the history of the world, if I truly believed that in sort of like a Whig version of history where everything is always getting a little bit better, that we're always, the arc of history is long but it bends towards justice, that 1848 would have been a turning point, right? We would have all together, thrown off the shackles of the old ways and had a more democratic world. Instead, basically what happens is the seeds are laid for World War I, for World War II, for basically every terrible thing that has happened since then, all the consequences of an unfree and undemocratic world that we live in. So 1848, real bad year. Oh, cherry on top, this is also one of the worst years of the Irish famine. Bad year. Bad year, 1848. Would not have liked to have lived during 1848. Next worst year, and this is definitely a contender for one of the worst years in history, is 1914, especially if we're looking sort of like from the end of the year back. At the beginning of 1914, Europe was rich, prosperous, peaceful. Everything was going fine. And then by December, hundreds of thousands of people had been killed, and there was a war basically engulfing the entire planet. And it was, worst of all, needless, destructive, violent, pointless. The Cousins War, just a bunch of dumb, poncy aristocrats thinking they could get some, points, win back a little bit of Alsace-Lorraine for their, whatever. Just millions upon millions of people dead for no good reason. Just absolute no point. Just war for war's sake. We are still dealing with the consequences of World War I. And I think that if you were living anywhere in the civilized world, or anywhere really, at the end of 1914, you would look back and say, boy, this really fucking sucks. Bad year to be alive. The world's being consumed by a pointless, violent conflict. The first really modern industrial war. People just dying in ways and in numbers that had not been at all conceivable up until that point. Bad year. Bad year surpassed perhaps only by 1918, a really, really bad year, which, saw the continuation and another incredibly violent year in World War I, but the beginning of a worldwide flu pandemic, the Spanish flu. There are estimates that the Spanish flu, and this is 1918, 1919, so this isn't all 1918, but I'm counting 1918 here, killed anywhere from 2 to 5% of the entire world population, 50 million people. It's possible that the flu killed in just September, October, and November of 1918. It killed more people than AIDS has killed in its entire existence among the human population. Also during this year are laid the seeds of future catastrophes. The Russian Civil War following the Russian Revolution. If things had maybe gone a little bit differently, if perhaps some Western countries had not thrown their lot in alongside the White Russians or the forces of the Tsar, things might have gone differently. Germany, if you were here for my talk on the Sturmabteilung a couple of weeks ago, things might have been different if, different decisions have been made, if different people had ended up in power in Germany. 1918, real fucking bad year for humanity. Yeah. The next bad year, 1933. In this year, Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. It is also one of the deepest, worst years of the Great Depression. Japan withdraws from the League of Nations. Now, this year wasn't all that bad in terms of, it was a bad year, but it wasn't, all that much direct suffering right away. And this was the year that we repealed Prohibition. FDR was elected. But ultimately, this is the year when the foundation is laid for some of the most miserable and catastrophic years of human existence. Just a truly abysmal, banner bad year. You're seeing the Reichstag fire here. I'm going to skip World War II, not because I don't think that it includes some of the worst years in history. It does. It was hard to pick one, and you all know. So just know that it was probably really awful to live through 1942 or 1944 as well, depending on where you lived. But yeah. And my last really bad year is actually 1968. And in 1968, we saw the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, some of the worst year, one of the worst years, the Vietnam War, including the My Lai massacre. The Prague Spring is crushed by Warsaw Pact troops. Riots overrun, American cities. It's one of the worst years for political violence in America. The French student strikes are crushed, without sort of achieving their goals. De Gaulle's coalition is swept back into power in 1968. Richard Nixon is elected president. This is a huge turn toward reaction, towards conservatism in the West especially, but all over the world. And it is a failure of the left the world over, and the failure of really liberals the world over to, sort of protect the gains that were made and to, fight for the world that they have been trying to build. Another bad year sort of for this general trend is 1979. But I think 1968 is the worst year. It starts a long turn that we are still living through, away from sort of social democracy, away from collective action, away from sort of a global consciousness, and towards individualism and reactionary forces. I think that, this is just ultimately one of the... If things had gone differently in 1968, if some of those assassinations had not happened, if some of those revolutionary movements had succeeded instead of being crushed, we'd be living in a very different world. So there are a lot of years I didn't cover. This was really kind of like a flip examination of a bunch of bad times. But as I am looking at 2020... this was a shit year for a lot of people I know, and a lot of people the year over. 340-something thousand Americans alone are dead. But I think that when you are looking at this year in the context of everything that I have talked about, history will look at this pandemic and they will see that a lot of the world population did a good job of managing it. China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Thailand, not perfectly, but like a huge proportion of humanity has managed and adapted to this pandemic very gracefully. The West has not. And I think that when we are looking back at this 50 years, 100 years from now, presumably from a very different future, hopefully not one where, seas have risen 10 meters or whatever, it's not going to look as bad as 1918. It's not going to look as bad as, 1783. It's not going to look as bad as 1347. It's going to be a very interesting year, right? It's going to be a year when a lot of things changed, but, I don't think it's going to look like one of the worst years on record. This is probably, apocryphal, but Chairman Mao was supposed to have said when he was asked about the French Revolution that it's too soon to tell what the outcome will be. And that's kind of how I'm feeling about the coronavirus. If you live in America, like I do, it is one of the worst years you have ever experienced. It is awful. We are fucking it up. People are dying by the thousands every single day. It is a catastrophe. From a global perspective, however, hard to say whether or not this is one of the worst years that we've ever lived through. I don't know if that makes you feel better. I don't know if that makes you feel worse. I don't know if you think that's inappropriate. I hope you don't. I feel miserable about everything that's happening here. I don't feel any better, given, the context, but it makes me less, makes me better able to sort of like sit with it. So, sorry for the downer of a talk. Thank you all for tuning in. This was fun. Happy New Year. Happy 2021. I'm going to have some more talks coming up. If you live in the United States, stick it out. Stay inside. Their vaccine is coming maybe eventually someday. And I mean, the silver lining is that globally, maybe as a species, we're handling this better than we have handled similar catastrophes in the past. That's the silver lining. If you're an American, I don't know that there's a silver lining. It's a bad time. But if you are somebody who perhaps wants to believe in a sort of like a greater human experience, it looks like we're doing a good job, right? I genuinely think, like, as a population, as a species, compared to other pandemics, we learned a lot. We're doing a good job. We as a species have mitigated this one pretty well. So that's the silver lining. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone. There'll be more talks this year, and yeah, have a great. I hope your 2021 is better than your 2020. Good night, everyone.